for today comes from Mark 10:35 through 45. And I have to admit, when I read the scripture for this week, I went, didn't we just do that? And then I was reminded that in Mark, we have the Passion prediction 3 times. And so this is the 3rd time. We did just do this a few weeks ago, but I don't know if you might remember the children's sermon, that in that one, the disciples are arguing over who is the greatest, right? And so in the children's sermon, I asked the kids who was the greatest, and Kevin was the perfect example because he told me how great he was, right? And so he has wonderful confidence. But so here again, like I said, we have the 3rd time where this seems to happen, this cycle, where you have the disciples who just don't get it, and you have Jesus, who's just in verse 32, right before our scripture for today, he's just done the Passion prediction for the 3rd time. And then each of the ways that Jesus teaches in each of these 3 instances is to teach them a type of discipleship. So that is this cycle. This is our 3rd time in Mark that it happens. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." You have to wonder in the world, what in the world were they thinking? To go to Jesus and say, we'll get him to agree to this before we ask him the question. Doesn't work. I'm surprised they thought it would. But they said, "Will you do for us whatever we ask of you?" And he said to them, "What is it you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" And they replied, "We are able." Then Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink, you will drink, and with the baptism which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or my left hand is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." And when the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. And Jesus called to them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. Whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave to all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." This is a really interesting text in so many ways, and very often it is preached from our understanding of what does it mean to be in ransom. It's also very interesting that the 2 different things that Jesus talks about are the 2 sacraments that we have in the United Methodist Church. The cup at the table, which hasn't happened yet, but his understanding with the disciples of being in fellowship around the table, and his baptism. And John has taught us that he baptized with water, but that Jesus was baptized with the Holy Spirit. If you recall the baptism story of Jesus, a dove descends upon him. God claims him and says, "You are mine, and with you I am well pleased." So what are the sons of Zebedee thinking, really? Here they conspire with just the 2 of them to elevate themselves above all the other disciples. And last time we were in this place, Jesus has already taught them that the first must be last. And if you really want to be great, you must serve others, right? And so there is a redundancy in Mark. He does seem to show that the disciples are a little dense and that they continually don't seem to understand what is going on, right? Which I think it helps us because we think we're sort of dense and we're pretty good at not getting it, right? And so maybe there's hope for us at these people who stand so close to Jesus. And so then they asked us a question, will you do for us whatever we ask? Have they not been listening to anything that Jesus said? Will you do for us? When he has clearly said to them over and over again, you should do for others. You should be the servant. You should be the slave. He actually uses the word slave. And we, as people who are Easter people, when we look at this story, we know what's going to happen next, right? We know that at the end of the story that there is suffering and a cross. And the people who are on the left and the right of Jesus are not in places of glory or honor. They're in places of suffering. And they're not great disciples. They're not super smart guys. They're not people of esteem. They're thieves. And it's so interesting that as he's on that cross, he has one who condemns and doesn't believe on one side, and he has one who gains belief. And then is given the blessing of, I will be with you. You will be with me, right? So as we think about what in the world are James and John thinking, the reason I wanted to talk about the Roman way of eating is maybe it was simply that practical, right? Where they're hanging out in communities where they're eating in the manner of the Romans. Maybe it's that simple. They just want to sit beside Jesus. It always cracks me up that all the paintings of the Last Supper, everybody's on one side of the table, right? And I know it's just for the ability to paint those who are at the Last Supper, but they would have been in some sort of round arrangement, probably not at a tall table, because that's part of our culture. That wasn't part of their culture. They would have been lounging. So maybe it's so simple. That's this hierarchy, this ranking of how important you are. And maybe they just want to be told, you know, you're my favorites, right? Or maybe James and John are thinking about the transfiguration. When on the mountaintop, when Jesus glows and Moses and Elijah, not Eliza, there is no Eliza. Elijah and Moses are on either side of Jesus at the mountaintop. Maybe that's what they're thinking. When the glory comes, I want to be one of the two people on that mountaintop. I want to be so important that I'm part of that, right? Or maybe it's their understanding of Messiah, their messianic thing that says he is going to triumph over all, and I want to be that guy that stands next to him. In the pictures, I'm there. Right? I get to stand on the left or the right. And James and John were some of the very first disciples that were called. They were there in the very beginning. And so maybe they already have a sort of elevated sense of self-worth. But then I started thinking about maybe there's some real fear there. Maybe because now they've heard 3 times that Jesus is going to be suffering and rejected, maybe they are getting more than we give them credit for. Maybe they're worried that something bad is going to happen, and so they want to be close to the one that they know can handle it. Right? Fear. Fear is something that makes us do and behave in ways that we normally wouldn't. And actually using Ashley as an example for someone who, when they're afraid, goes to spend the night at their mom's house, it's the same thing. I want to be close to someone who gives me confidence, that makes me feel secure. And so maybe James and John are just trying to secure their place in knowing it's going to be okay. After 9/11 in our country, in the midst of fear and terrorism, we started giving permission to our government to do things that never would we have given permission for before. We gave the government an okay to listen to our phone calls when in very recent history we had impeached a president over the very idea of listening into our phone calls. In the mainline church, I know of a church, a Methodist church, that as a retiring pastor looked at his legacy and his fear that this church he had devoted his life to wouldn't be around, that he raised $35 million to an endowment to make sure that that building would be taken care of. To me, that speaks of fear. Fear that my legacy won't be here, fear that this church will no longer exist. And so what he has done is he has ensured that a building will be there. A building. But the reality is, a building is not the church unless it is filled with the people of God. A building is just a building. It is not a church. And maybe it could be a great museum or a hip restaurant or a coffee shop or something like that in the future. But the building will be there, right? Because in his fear, he has ensured the legacy of a building. Fear breeds a desire for security. And I will have to admit that I have been holding fear. That ever since I got my appointment, that I worried about the finances and the fear that someday I would be cut off from the conference office and we would be forced to sink or swim, you know? And so I have carried some of that. And in the midst of that, my husband has reminded me, God has a plan and let go. You can't carry that around, it's too heavy. We as a congregation have had fear of changing spaces, right? Most of churches get one space, they're in it forever, and they suffer through very little change. But all new congregations, they go through constant change. Just being here is our third place, right? We started at Camp Lockridge, and we were thankful that anybody would let us gather in their space, right? And then we were in the coffee shop across the street. And what a blessing that having worship in there, that we outgrew that space. And then we came here so we could have room for the children. Whoops. And so we did that. And so now we're faced with this building with 5 acres, and all of those feelings and all of those fears and all of those uncertainties rise up again. And we want to stand close to Jesus and be assured that we're in a safe place, right? Are we not just like the sons of Zebedee, begging for the assurance that secures the future? That if we could just stand close enough to Jesus, everything would be okay. But we know that in this story that Jesus faces rejection and suffering and even death. But yet he promises us that we will drink from the same cup, that we will gather at the table with him, and we will be baptized like he was, where we are claimed as his own. And the Holy Spirit descends upon us. And God says it's good. And we're good, right? And so in the midst of fear, I see James and John remind me of myself and even our congregation. This man named Charles Campbell wrote this beautiful homiletical perspective on this text that I wanted to share with you. He starts with, James and John, you too will be crucified. Isn't that what you're asking to be part of? However, in the larger context of the story, Jesus' words may also be read as an extraordinary promise. You will not always be driven by your fear and your need for security. Rather, you will be empowered to take up your cross and follow me. You will be faithful disciples even to the end. Here is the great promise for the church. We need not always live in fear. We need not continually seek our own security. Rather, we have Jesus' promise that we can and will live as faithful disciples as we seek to follow him. It is an extraordinary promise made to such a bumbling group of disciples then and now. And finally, this text suggests the shape of the church's discipleship Jesus calls the church to embody an alternative to what a man named Walter Wink calls the domination system. In his concluding teaching to the 12, Jesus calls the disciples to offer an alternative to the Gentiles, among whom rulers lord it over them, and the great ones are tyrants over them. The way of the cross, Jesus affirms, is to serve each other, to serve the world. There is no ranking at the table. There is no deciding which of us is more valuable and who can sit closest to Jesus. Yes, the cross calls us to bear the burdens of life and to bear the burdens of each other and even bear the burdens of being part of the church. But in the midst of all of this, I keep hearing Edna call me to something more than that. I keep hearing Ron's excitement about wanting to feed people. I keep hearing people say how exciting this is. And so when I want to curl up under the covers or obsessively vacuum or any of those things, I have to step into the darkness. I have to be okay. And so I asked Edna if she would share some of the ways that we have seen God working in the midst of all of this change and uncertainty. With the building, with the idea of being a thrift store, with the idea of blessing the community. Eldon, Edna's husband, it was so funny, he pointed out to us recently this hawk. And there was a hawk right on the little fence around the door by the chapel. And this big, beautiful, like 14 to 16 inch hawk. And so it was sitting there, and it let Eldon walk right by it and go in, and he whispered for us to all come and see the bird, right? And what's so ironic is I had seen that bird weeks before sitting on the top of the light pole staring at me. And so I looked up, what is the hawk? Are there any symbolism for the hawk? And of course in the Old Testament, in Leviticus, which seems to get us all, in Leviticus it says it's a bird of death and it's a bad omen, right? And so I was like, that can't be the end of it, right? And so there are other instances where the hawk is seen as hopeful, and then the tamed hawk or falcon as a path, being able to have a large perspective instead of getting caught in the small problems.
We'll take that one.
Being able to see the big picture, right? And then the last one that I read talked about the hooded hawk. And the hooded hawk, which there is no fear, and is about that even in the darkness, the hawk knows its way. And so, yeah, I decided to let go of the Leviticus text and embrace the other ones about the hawk. And so, yeah, so we have this like watcher over us there that is hanging out and watching what we're doing and getting closer and closer. And it's just been a beautiful blessing. I have said before that I find God in nature so often. So for me, the hawk was an assurance of something wonderful too. But and I wanted Edna to tell you about Heritage United Methodist Church and sort of the process of how we got to this place, because the Heritage Memorial, or Harrison Memorial, was a church that died and closed its doors this year. And so from that we have been blessed. But Edna, if you'll come, I'll let you talk on my microphone. There's just been so many wonderful things that have happened. Just hold it.
Okay, does that work?
Yeah.
Okay. Heather mentioned the thrift shop, and she mentioned Harrison. And my friend who died in June had a bunch of really nice clothes, and my friend said she'd give them to us, but I didn't want the clothes until we had a clothes rack to put them on. And Heather said, there's the coat rack in Harrison. So we went to get it. And the first trip, it wouldn't fit through the door. And John and Elton tried so hard. It's not a pretty thing, but
it holds clothes.
And it's a sturdy to hold Ken's nice clothes. And halfway back to Glenpool, we got all this other stuff, treasures.
Yeah.
And halfway back to Glenpool, Elton said, I think I figured it out. And I said, what? How to get it through the door. So we made another trip to get the coat rack, or the clothes rack through the door. And then we made another trip and another trip. We caravan pickups and Jackie's trailer.
It was like vultures. We were like vultures.
And you could say that we stripped that poor church, but we rescued those treasures. And they'll have an opportunity to be a blessing. And yeah, there was some junk, but on one trip, there were 6 of us. And of the 6, only 2 were really able to do very well. Jackie and John loaded all the heavy stuff. 4 of us have physical issues and couldn't. And I felt so guilty, and I'm sorry, John. I was hoping Jackie would be here so I could say, sorry, Jackie. But the rest of us did what we could, and it wasn't as much. But we did what we could to help. And then we went again and again. We made 4 trips, and each one was fun. One was in the afternoon, but I don't remember which. It was hot. And when we got back to the church, oh, and you got to go up the stairs to get stuff, or down the stairs to get stuff and haul it back, and it was hot. And when we got back, she said, we look like the grapes of wrath.
We were all piled up, it was awful.
Sweaty and stinky, and we did. But it was a happy grapes of wrath.
Okay, tell them about Travis.
Okay, can I do it with just a minute? I'll
Yeah,
talk
yeah,
about Travis.
you have another.
Okay, I found this at Harrison, and it's beautiful. And when I started to hang it up at the chapel, it came from a church. It's beautiful. But it had gotten broken. The top was broken off. And the string was broken and it was crooked. And I thought, Eldon can fix this. That's my famous last words. Eldon can fix this.
We're going to call him poor Eldon someday.
And this morning I said, Eldon, can you fix that? And he said, oh yeah, just da-da-da-da-da. And he took it, I'm finished with it now.
Okay.
Thank you. He took it to the shop and he came back and he hung it on my back porch, and it was beautiful in the sunshine. And yeah, it's got a big old knot and the things don't hang quite level. And the top is broken off and kind of fixed back, but it's beautiful. And I will share that with you. We can share it. It can go from one to the other, or it can stay on my back porch. But it's beautiful. It needs to be shared. And then, one more thing and I'll stop.
No,
She wanted me, gave me the opportunity to talk about the trash man. Heather ordered a trash dumpster for us, and the man came to deliver, and we met him out front. When are y'all picking up? And he said, well, your pickup day is tomorrow. And Ron said, oh good. We will have this finished by this afternoon. How much would it cost to have you bring another one? Because we got a lot of trash. And the guy said, well, I'll check. And he said, we don't need to tell Heather this. I'll pay for it. But he was so gung-ho on making it look nice. And the dumpster man went back and talked to people, and then he backed that dumpster up to the front door. And he helped us load the trash. Jenny.
He was the muscle.
Yes, I don't have
He
any.
was just great.
He helped us load it. And Jenny, I couldn't. The junk in that room, I couldn't. Some of it was my junk, and I kept thinking, oh, somebody could use this. I couldn't get rid of it. But Jenny could. And we're so thankful that Jenny
Because
could.
I didn't have my own junk there.
We're just all going to share each other's stuff, right?
I
And,
didn't know.
and we did. And she was in the room getting it out. And I'm out front with the trash man going, can you use this? And he said, I have a friend who I think could fix that. So he took some of our trash.
And our electronics. He took it
Yeah.
all.
I have a friend. And one thing, I don't remember what it was, but it was metal and square, and he said, I don't think so, but I'll recycle it for you. And he was just this most wonderful man. We filled that dumpster in an hour, thanks to Jenny. And
thanks to
then,
him, and he stayed and worked with us. You know, he didn't have to do that.
he
That's
did
right.
not. He took that dumpster back to wherever they take them, dumped it and brought it back, backed up to the front porch, and we loaded it, a good portion of it again, the old dishwasher and some of the stuff outside. And he took stuff, some of the treasures to give away, some of it to recycle, and what a blessing it is to be a part of that. I love this treasure. I love to hear the chimes. And yeah, it may not be as beautiful as it once was, but it's still beautiful and it is still a treasure.
Oh, thank you, Edna. So I thought that as I looked at James and John, and the sons of Zebedee and all their messiness, that I resembled that, the fear of that, and the walking into the darkness, being okay with that. And I think that as our church continues to evolve and continues to grow and continues to live into who we are, that we'll face scary things again. Maybe not immediately, but we're going to be okay. Because we're sitting next to Jesus, and we're listening, and we're praying, and we're allowing ourselves to be led. And that makes it all right.